Welcome back. Today is about chapter 5, which covers the concept called conveyances, and we're going to have the following objectives. Number 1, define the term title and how it relates to real estate. Number 2, we're going to define how title is transferred. And finally, what exactly is conveyance and what's involved in it? First of all, what exactly is a title? Well, a title gives you the right of ownership. You can use it, enjoy it, sell it, abandon it. So basically, you're entitled to that piece of property. To convey a title is to transfer a title from one owner to another. Specific to real estate, the conveyance or transfer of title of real property is called alienation. There are 2 types of alienation: voluntary and involuntary. Of course, a voluntary is friendly. It usually involves a sale or a gift. Involuntary, unfortunately, usually requires some legal action. A lot of title conveyances can also involve the government. They include patent, forfeiture, dedication, and eminent domain. And here are explanations for all of them. A patent is a conveyance of title from the government to private owners. Many times the land that you own can be traced back to the government as the first grantor, because most likely they're the ones who discover the land in the first place. The second one is a forfeiture, and you really don't want to be in this situation, because in forfeiture, property is forfeited to the government if someone used it to commit a crime. Next, and much more pleasant, is dedication. That's when private property is either gifted or donated to the public. Within the concept of dedication, there is a subconcept called the statutory dedication. That is when a developer is required to turn over a land for public use. A common example is a subdivision development, and the developer has purchased the entire piece of land, but then some streets are then turned over to the public for public use. Another subconcept is the common law dedication. That's when private property owners already allow their land to be used for the public. And it's been happening for quite some time. Then the government can declare the property to have been dedicated for public use. Finally, eminent domain, which gives the government the right to acquire the title of a property by paying the private owner fair compensation. Some examples include building schools, public parks, highways, and airports. The actual term for undergoing an eminent domain is called a condemnation. This process is not ideal because it's a process that's required by the government for people who do not want to sell their properties for public use. You have to undergo a condemnation proceeding, and there's usually some issues that you would have to work through. Under eminent domain, private landowners must be paid a just compensation. This includes compensation for damages, severance damages, and that's for the losses in value of the portion of the property that will not be taken. And lastly, consequential damages. And that's for the loss of value to you if it's caused by the surrounding properties being taken. If the consequential damages are extreme, you can sue for inverse condemnation, which will require the government to take and pay for the property. Conveyance of title can also be caused by physical action. There are 2 types of physical actions: accession and devolution. Accession means additions to the land, and it can be man-made or natural. If it's man-made, it's called annexation. If it's natural, it's called accretion. Avulsion means the sudden tearing away of land by water. But if you lose land this way, it shouldn't cause the automatic taking away of your title. The title of a land can also be taken away by a legal term called adverse possession. A simpler way to understand it is trespassing. It's a little hard to understand, so bear with me. For example, you have a piece of land, but you've kind of abandoned it, and your next door neighbor has been using it for a very long time. Your neighbor can actually take that piece of land away as long as he or she can satisfy the following conditions. Number 1 is that the action is hostile, as in it's against you, the real owner's will. Number 2, it is actual, as in your neighbor has full control over that piece of land. Number 3, it is exclusive, as in your neighbor, the trespasser, cannot share that land with anyone else. Number 4, it is open and notorious, as in your neighbor is not shy about using that land. They are posting it on social media, they are telling everyone about it. To you, it sounds crazy, but really in their mind, they already own it. And finally, it is continuous and uninterrupted. And in the state of Washington, that is 10 years. I know it sounds crazy, but it is written in the law. Now, the last concept of the conveyance of title involves the unfortunate event of someone's death. If the owner of the property dies, the property can be passed on to someone else with or without probate. In this situation, without probate is probably most ideal. That usually means that there's already some type of legal instrument to base the conveyance of title on. For example, perhaps there's already a joint tenancy on the property, and the surviving tenant can just take the other one's property under the right of survivorship. Probate is a little more taxing, so the government or the court will have to get involved. They would need to collect the deceased person's assets. They would have to pay the person's debts to creditors, and they would have to help distribute what's remaining of the person's estates to the people who are entitled to it. Hopefully, the person has left a will, so the court can distribute according to what the will says. A person receiving what's left in the will, as in real property, is called a devisee. A person who receives personal properties from a will is called a legatee. If the property is a community property and most likely shared by a married couple, even if there is no will, the surviving spouse will get the property. The legal term for someone who dies and has a will is called testate, and when someone dies without a will is called instate. In this case, the title is transferred to the descendants' heirs. It's also properly probated to ensure that if there are more than one heir, it's distributed evenly. If there are no heirs, then unfortunately the property goes to the government. The conveyance of a title can also be caused by court action. The most common court action scenarios are partition suit, a divorce decree, and bankruptcy. A partition suit separates co-owners' interests. A divorce decree transfers the title from one spouse to another. And a bankruptcy normally requires a property to be sold. So there's money, at least some, to pay back the creditors. And that concludes Chapter 5, Conveyances. Let's quickly sum everything up. Conveyance in this case means a conveyance of title, and that's title to property. A title is an intangible right to ownership. The word alienation stands for transferring title from one person to another, and it may be a voluntary alienation or involuntary. A title can also be conveyed by the government through a patent, forfeiture, dedication, or eminent domain. Next, we talked about physical actions that affect title of property. Accession means additions to land, and it is separated into natural and unnatural. Unnatural or man-made is called annexation, and additions to land by natural causes is called accretion. And tearing away of land by water is called avulsion. Next up is deeds. Title may be lost by a process called adverse possession, and that applies to trespassers. And it gives the trespassers title to property if it is actual, open, hostile, exclusive, and continuous. In Washington, continuous means at least 10 years. Title can also be transferred by the property owner's death, either through probate or without probate. Now, if the deceased person does not have a will, it's not a community property, so no married couple share it, and there are no heirs, then the property would return to the government, and the process is called an escheat. Sometimes it's also pronounced escheat or escheat. Lastly, title can also be conveyed through a court action involving a partition suit, a divorce decree, or a bankruptcy. And that is it for today. Next up is deeds, and we'll see you next time.